Sorry, battery in the mic died just before I got up, apparently. So if you will join me in really Acts chapter 2, we will look at the subject this morning, forward. The subject forward. And the verse, however, that we have for the scripture reading talks about the way in which the apostles were greatly esteemed as they began to realize that even though Jesus was not there, some of the things that they had seen him doing were being manifested in these men who were carrying his ministry forward. And the reason why that caught my attention this week especially was for the way in which, if you look at the end of the book of John, as Jesus 3 times is telling Peter, or basically asking him as he's restoring him, he's like, Peter, do you love me? The first time he says more than these, right? And then 3 times he's going to ask Peter if he loves him. And that third time, it's going to say that Peter is grieved. And so it reminded me that as of this time, we have a family who is going through grief. If you understand the whole concept of Pentecost, that's what, 50 days? Within 50 days, what I got a chance to witness yesterday was exactly what we see with the apostles. Because within 50 days, their grief had turned to honor. And so as we had people honoring the young man yesterday, filling the pews, as some folks said, with more folks than they had ever seen in this building before. In a very short order, what happened was a moment of grief, which is going to take a while to heal from, began to turn to a moment of honor and esteem, as people talked about from his friends to his family member, what his life meant to them. And so when we're looking at Acts chapter 2, that's one of the things that it reminded me of, as we see in a very short order in the book of Acts, the grief that Peter had as Jesus was questioning him began to turn to a level of honor that, as he had promised, no one would be able to take from them. And so understand that going on, what we're going to see is yesterday, one of the things that needs to be commended is the way in which Brother Barry gave words of comfort to the family yesterday as they are trying to move forward in their healing, in their time of restoration, recovery, and things like that. One of the things that he had a chance to say during the words of encouragement valued the life of the young man and talked about the way in which, in contrast to some others, he said, and I'm going to paraphrase it quite possibly wrong, so correct me if I got it wrong. He basically said that there's some people we could do without, but that wasn't the life of this particular young man. And so one of the things I want to do is I want to hone it in on that concept, because the flip side of that is the reality of Jesus' execution is there was a group in Israel who thought we could do without Jesus, and that was a consequence that actually caused the entire nation to suffer. Likewise, what we're seeing in the book of Acts is likewise there is a growing division in the people that is very similar to what we saw in the end of Jesus' life. We said he came to bring not peace, but a sword. And what we saw was a growing division in Israel during the life of Jesus' ministry. And during the book of Acts, that's the same thing that we are going to see growing as the apostles, as we say, I'm talking about picking up the baton pretty much every week now. As they are picking up the baton in these first few chapters of the book of Acts, that same division is growing amongst the people. There are 2 patterns that are taking shape. And one of the things I want to do is I just want to hone it down a little bit more biblically, because basically if you look back at the Old Covenant in the ESV, and it might be, if you do look it up in your own version, but compared to the ESV, one of the things that the Bible does when it's talking about that whole concept of people that God actually considers, it might sound harsh, that his kingdom would be better without, he literally uses the term worthless. And even though he uses the term worthless with regard to people in the Old Covenant, you don't see it as much in the New Covenant. But what we do see in those 2 paths are a path that leads to the kind of honor and esteem and value that we see in the lives of the apostles, and a worthless path that leads to things that God is telling us we would do well to stay away from. And so that is the shape that the division begins to take in the book of Acts, as we begin to look at the lives of the apostles as they begin to try to move on from the time of the Christ. And one of the earliest divisions comes forth in probably one of the most famous passages, Acts chapter 2, before Peter even gets up to preach the sermon on the day of Pentecost. In verses 11 and 12, really 11 through 13, we're going to see a division emerging amongst the people as they're beginning to speak in their own language. It's going to say in verse 11, both Jews and proselytes, Cretans and Arabians, we hear them telling in our own tongue the mighty works of God. and all were amazed and perplexed, saying to one another, "What does this mean?" But others, mocking, said, "They are filled with new wine." That's just a shallow version of the division that's going to continue to grow as the sermon on the day of Pentecost at the end of chapter 2 is going to lead to about 3,000 being saved in verse 41. But the division is going to continue to grow as in chapter 3, they're going to heal a man at the gate called Beautiful. And that is going to continue to attract the attention of people even beyond the 3,000. However, it is going to create another path, like we mentioned, that worthless path in verses 26 going forward. It's going to say, God, having raised up his servant, sent him to you first to bless you by turning every one of you from your wickedness. But the response is going to be in chapter 4, verses 3 and 4, where it's going to say, and the others, however, arrested them and put them in custody until the next day, for it was already evening. But many of those who had heard the word believed, and the number of men came to about 5,000. Understanding that we have the two paths forming up in those who are beginning to grow a resentment. Why? Because they are, before too long, going to realize that the words the apostles are preaching are condemnation to them because they were responsible for the death of the Christ. But not everybody has that response. Because in chapter 2, part of what we see is the famous statement in response to what Peter said, "Men and brethren, what shall we do?" Because there are those who acknowledge they were responsible for what happened to the Christ, but instead of closing ranks and trying to pretend like nothing wrong happened, they were, as it says, cut to the heart, and they began to make the kinds of changes that were necessary for them to be reconciled to God. Sorry, I got so excited I lost my page. But toward the end of chapter 5, we're going to see the pattern continue. Why? Because by the time we get to verse 17, where we have the scripture reading from this morning, we're talked about in verses 12 through 16. The fact that by the time the Holy Spirit had fallen on the apostles, they had grown to such high esteem that people simply wanted to be touched by their shadow. And that was enough for them to produce the healing. But the division continued in verse 17 where it says, "But the high priest rose up and all who were with him," that is the party of the Sadducees, and filled with jealousy, they arrested the apostles and put them in the public prison. However, it's going to say that the jail was open and they continued to preach until the division is going to continue into chapter 6, where we have the famous stoning of Stephen. At that point, we're going to park a little bit and back up to chapter 5, and we're going to look at, in more detail, what is it that helps us to understand not only why the division was beginning to form in Israel at this time, but what are some of the red flags? What are some of the red flags that were helping the people decide who it was that they were going to follow during the days of this growing movement in Israel, But with regard to Stephen, one of the first martyrs, it's going to talk about the way that they are picking deacons in the first 7 verses. Why? Because there was a growing division, not between the believers and the non-believers, but even within the believers, the Hellenists or the Greek Jews versus those who were of the what we call the nation of Israel proper. They were having a division, a famous division you probably heard before, of the division of the distribution amongst the widows. Not all the widows were being treated fairly. And so what happened was they appointed 7 men who were, in verse 3, full of good repute and the spirit and wisdom to sort out the dispute while the apostles continued to devote their time and attention to preaching. One of those men was Stephen, and his presence was even stronger than what was talked about in the first 7 verses, because verse 8 is going to say, "And Stephen, full of grace and power, was doing great wonders and signs amongst the people. Then some of those who belonged to the synagogue of the freedmen, as it was called, and of the Cyrenians, and of the Alexandrians, and of those of Cilicia and Asia rose up and disputed with Stephen," showing us once again, that growing division was mounting in Israel. But if I had to just slow it down and try to give us some practical points today for why this matters at all, I'm going to ask you to back up to chapter 5 with me so we can look at the way that it begins to take shape in chapter 5. as what we see in verse 17. As we already mentioned, says the Sadducees the high priest and the Sadducees, filled with jealousy, arrested the apostles. And that goes back to something we saw in the life of the Christ. What happened is, if I'm looking for one of those, take a step back, one of those signs, red flags we've already called them, for indications of a path that God considers to be worthless. In a lot of ways, it goes back to what we saw in the Old Covenant, when he was still using that term to literally talk about or describe the kind of character that he considered to mark the worthless path. When you look at a man like Nabal in the life of David, what happens is David, as he is fleeing from Saul, he is looking for places where he can find refuge and comfort and peace. And along the way, he's protected the land of a man named Nabal, married to a woman by the name of Abigail. And what happens is, after protecting Nabal's property, he sends some of his servants to simply ask for a little bit of what Nabal has on a feast day. And Nabal answers David harshly. And as Abigail and some of his servants are beginning to try to create peace between David, who's growing more and more agitated and more frustrated, not only because of his interaction with Nabal, but Nabal does not understand that all of the pressure of what has been transpiring between David and Saul is getting to David. And so now his harsh answer is what we probably use the term even recently in talking about the way that Jesus at times would have what seemed to be a flare of his temper over what seemed to be a very small thing. David is now about to incur what Abigail has identified as blood guilt if someone does not step in and intercede on behalf of him and the household of Nabal, those who had nothing to do with the indignity that Nabal had lobbed at David. And so what happens is, his own servants identify Nabal as a man whose very name means fool or foolish, as one who is worthless. And so the first thing we begin to see is when God is identifying parts of my character, or times when I've stepped off onto a path that is worthless. It's times when I've gotten to the habit where folks can no longer talk to me, or I will not respond even to the greatest wisdom or the most reasonable appeal. Understanding that, his wife will go to David and say, please show mercy to us, because we're caught in the middle of a situation where we have this man who will not listen, and you, who we know, you're in a delicate moment. And so the one thing that she does as a woman of reason is follow the pattern that we will see in the lives of the apostles as we move forward to the Acts. Before that, we see in the life of a man by the name of Sheba, again in the life of David. David, after he has been cast out of his own kingdom because of his own sins with Bathsheba, he's restored. And we've had the indication that in the life of Saul, there was something that God was displeased with, that he wanted to restore, and he restored it through David. But he was not cutting David a pass because David had his own sins. But even as David had been restored to the kingdom after Absalom had basically put him out of his own house, his own city, and off of his own throne, there's a man of Sheba, there was a man by the name of Sheba who continued on in the same pattern that we saw in the line of Saul and in the line of Absalom. And unwilling to look at what God was doing in the life of David, Sheba mounted another rebellion. And the word is going to describe Sheba as a worthless man. And then even beyond that, when you look beyond the reign of David to the days of Ahab, one of the third examples we'll see of that concept of worthlessness is in the life of Ahab, when Naboth's vineyard was a territory that Ahab had decided he had eyes for. And even though he couldn't get it, his wife decided that she was going to help him get it by basically getting what the Bible is going to describe as worthless people, individuals who had no regard for the truth, to make up a charge against Naboth so that then his vineyard could be claimed and taken by Ahab. And the thing to see in all of those situations is the pattern that we'll see in Acts is I'm in danger when I'm on a path where the most reasonable words that you might be able to speak to me, as we saw with Nabal, fall on deaf ears, to where I get so influenced by the situation that my value for truth becomes almost nothing. And I become so caught up in a pattern that I don't want to let go of, that once again, the intervention of God himself won't set me on a path that's healthy. All of those things are going to be things that we see appearing again in the book of Acts. Because as we go back to verse 17, of chapter 5. There's three things that we'll be able to see. Verses 17, and 28, and 33. And so it's three characteristics that begin to develop the division that's growing in Israel. As we've already mentioned with the high priest and the Sadducees, a lot of what's going on with the people is they're experiencing a great healing right now. It's a time when even those who have participated in the death of the Christ were realizing how great the forgiveness that Christ was bringing them would be. But it was the unwillingness, as we see maybe in the example of individual like Nabal, to understand the pressing nature of the situation, that even though, as our brother in the communion talk mentioned, the way that Christ's sacrifice means that there's an opportunity for our lawless deeds to be remembered no more. It also goes on in Hebrews to basically say, if we realize that level of forgiveness, but we continue to walk in a pattern of sin after realizing how great the forgiveness God offers us is, then there is no longer a sacrifice for sin. But the only thing that we can expect after rejecting a reconciliation that great is the fire that is expecting or awaiting the adversaries. And so that's what you see as you continue on in the book of Hebrews. And that is what he's talking about in Acts chapter 2 as we move forward along that path. Why? Because by the time you get to verse 28, one of the things that we are going to see is as they have, unlike the crowd that is beginning, much like they saw in the life of Jesus, to realize the advantages that they are appreciating when the healing of those who, much like the woman of blood, talks about the number of years that she had been suffering. The healing by the pool of Bethesda talks about the number of years that that man had not been able to walk. And likewise, the men who have been blind from birth. It's one thing if you look at those stories, and for me, it's just a moment in time as I read their story of their suffering. But the prolonged nature of their suffering is something that once Jesus died, they thought it was over. But now if you can put yourself in the position of those who thought that once Jesus died, then so did the healing, now they're starting to see their second chance. And if you've ever been in life in a situation where you needed a second chance or a second opportunity, then you realize that they don't come around all the time. And so what's happening is, as the apostles are now able to do some of the same miracles that they saw Jesus do, the nation is realizing that it has a second chance on what it might have missed out on in its moment of anger and fury against the Christ. But what's happening is the religious leaders are so invested in keeping their reputation intact that they are denying the people the opportunity to have access to the very apostles who are now bringing the healing. And so that is the division that we are beginning to see. It is the division between the people who responded and formed the first church could have been just as offended at the word of the apostles as what we're seeing out of the chief priests. But what they realized is it's more than me. There are other people who need healing at this time. And so that's where the two paths are forming. What's happening is, reminds me of times when, in years past, I had trouble seeing what we would call the forest for the trees. Times in which my own sense of guilt might have kept me in a place where I often talk about it. It's easy for me to point fingers and say, excuses are bad. It's unhealthy to deflect in times when I need to just take responsibility. But the only reason I can speak from experience in that regard is because I've lived my life in places where I wanted to deflect. I wanted to be in a place where I was just somewhere else. As David will say in one of the Psalms, if I had wings, I would just fly away. I've been in a place where I know what it's like to just feel the need to point the finger and say it's someone else. And so one of the reasons why I can talk about the transformation that God brings is that there are times when, as I've become more comfortable with that whole concept of confession. Confession is one of the things that makes me a little bit less, I'll say, defensive than I used to be. And it helps me to open up in times when other people's healing is blocked by my excuses. It's blocked by my inability or unwillingness to acknowledge the truth. And these are the two paths that we are seeing here in Israel. It is the degree to which the apostles could restore everything that the Christ had going on during his ministry. But it's being blocked by people who are not allowing Christ to come in and make the changes in their hearts that are necessary to basically restore Israel to what it could have been all the time under the Christ. How do we know? Because by the time we get to verse 27, it's going to read, and when they had brought them, they set them before the council. And the high priest questioned them, saying, we strictly charged you not to teach in this name. Yet you have filled Jerusalem with your teaching, and you intend to bring this man's blood upon us all. Going back, we see the way that they actually did charge them in verse 18 of chapter 4. After the council had convened, it's going to say, so they called them and charged them not to speak or teach at all in the name of Jesus. But Peter and John answered them, whether it is right in the sight of God to listen to you rather than God, you must judge. For we cannot but speak of what we have seen and heard. And going back to what we saw in chapter 5. What's going to happen is the problem isn't so much that Peter and John are offering railing accusations against the chief priests, the Sadducees, etc. It's the truth that is actually becoming offensive. In my life, there are times when I've had to grow to the point where I realized that when the word talks about speaking the truth in love, sometimes I can be my own worst enemy because I get so fixated on a true thing that I might have that I speak it in a hostile and improper or just an insensitive way. I've talked about that before. And so what the apostles don't have to worry about here is the way in which they are speaking and the effect it's going to have on people, because they're saying a simple truth. And beyond the truth, if you skip down to verse 29, they're going to say, but Peter and the apostles answered, much like we saw back in chapter 4, we must obey God rather than men. The God of our fathers raised Jesus, whom you killed by hanging him on a tree. Backing up even further, they're going to say, much like Christ did in his response to the same councils and authorities, don't worry about what we say. As a man, I can be offensive. I can flounder. I can pause. I can have all kinds of things that get in the way of receiving the message. But understand the works. That is one of the things that actually gives life. And what is happening is the things that they are doing are the same things that the Christ did. And so regardless of what they're saying, the position that the growing division in Israel is facing is they're not arguing against the men. They're arguing against the deeds and the improvement and the progress that the men basically have been able to accomplish in the time that they have been working since the time that the Christ left. And so beyond that, what's happening is in verse 33, it's going to read, when they heard this, they were enraged and wanted to kill them. But a Pharisee in the council named Gamaliel, a teacher of the law, held in high honor by all the people, stood and gave orders to put the men outside for a little while. And he said to them, men of Israel, take care with what you are about to do with these men. For before these days, Theudas rose up, claiming to be somebody, and a number of men, about 400, joined him, and he was killed. And all who followed him were dispersed and came to nothing. After him, Judas, the Galilean, rose up in the days of the census and drew away some of the people after him. He too perished, and all who followed him were scattered. So in the present case, I tell you, keep away from these men and let them alone. For if this plan or this undertaking is of man, it will fail. But if it is of God, you will not be able to overthrow them. You might even be found to be opposing God. So they took his advice. And when they had called in the apostles, they beat them and charged them not to speak in the name of Jesus and let them go. And they left the presence of the council rejoicing that they were counted worthy to suffer dishonor for the name. And every day in the temple and from house to house, they did not cease teaching and preaching Jesus as the Christ. Three things that hopefully we can gather from what we see in the division that's growing in Israel at this time. The first thing we've already mentioned, it's not so much the perspective that they're having, being so defensive that they cannot allow the work to continue on in a way that's blessing so many, being so fixated in verse 28 on the charge that they have made to the apostles not to speak, that they're offended by the fact that the apostles have disobeyed them in their obedience to God. And then finally in verse 33, being enraged. So enraged at them that they begin to, in some ways, like we say, they want to kill them. Before ultimately cooler heads prevail. And Gamaliel steps up and intercedes in an otherwise hostile situation. But honestly, in a time like this where I honestly can't talk with any kind of clarity about what the source of my confusion is, because right now I just can't, sometimes my pauses are picking the right words. Sometimes my pauses are, as I say from time to time, it's picking the right path. But right now, just maybe it's the context of what we're going through. Maybe it's the context of me possibly just not picking the right passage or the right concept for the right time. It just might be the fact that just sometimes in life, you reach an impasse where the crossroads you have to face, it's not for other people, it's just for you. I'm going to just sum up what I had in mind before this weekend. And ultimately what happened was, at this point in Israel's history, what's happening is, as we said, beauty of what I heard Brother Glenn say during the messages, Christ died to erase all our lawless deeds. And so from that perspective, there's a reason why you no longer see the Bible talking about people as worthless. And so when we see those two different paths that begin to manifest, one of the reasons why it was so important for me to at least try to address it is because beyond what happened with, what we said, the whole concept of the Christ, right? Being deemed worthless by a part of Israel in a way that damaged the rest. Beyond all that, I just know that there are times in my life where what I used to do, the thing I loved about what Brother Barry said yesterday was it helped me understand that beyond what he said, he spent so much time with the family that he knew intimately the young man's working relationship. He knew very well the young man's character. He knew very well what he meant not just to the family, but to the community. Because if he only meant something to his family, we wouldn't have had as many people here as we had on Sunday. As we had yesterday at the service. That's the value that I've seen over my time as a minister in understanding not just the word, right? Because I prepared some words from the Bible, but I don't know the family as well as Brother Barry did. One of the things that I was hoping to do is take the beauty of what he did yesterday and help us to understand that we are living in days and times where that whole concept of the value of life, it's an important principle to emphasize the value of this young man's life. But on the flip side, we're also in a time where I'm really reluctant to diminish the value of the people who we've lost. Does that make sense? We are in a time where we have a number of folks who are no longer meeting with us. And even though there are strong, rigid differences or divisions of opinion regarding the matters that led to the disfellowship, ultimately, each one of those people matter to someone. And ultimately, each one of those people, just in the short time that I've been here, even though if we go back to the very beginning, you understand, I've had doctrinal differences with both sides. But I've grown to a point where, personally, in my relationship, understanding that I sometimes say too much, the brother who was disfellowshipped and I, we didn't see eye to eye on very many things. But we had gotten to a point where I could look at him as a man and meet with him as a man and realize that in some ways our interests conflicted as preachers. Let's be honest, preachers fight. And for me, I have a better start the more he's willing to step back and just let me flap my wings. But ultimately what happens is I have to look beyond my personal interest to realize that this man has a walk as well. And the thing that I began to see as I began to meet and talk with that gentleman was he was beginning to heal in some ways. He was beginning to heal to the point where the same kind of friction that we might have had early on was beginning to die down. We were beginning to be able to make some peace. The reason why I mention that is the only reason I wanted to take some time and talk about the way that the Bible talks about the whole concept of worthlessness. The way that the Bible talks about that whole concept of people that we might do better to be without. Is that doesn't fit the description of anyone with whom I've worshiped at this church during my time here. And that is the only thing that I was hoping to clear up in this early look at the book of Acts, where in chapters 3 through 9, which you are looking at, you're not looking at the value of people as much as you're looking at the value of the choices that they are making. And what is happening here is even as the apostles are being dispersed, because there are certain people who are going to continue on a worthless path, and they are going to continue to try to stamp out the things that they are being done, because just like it said early on, it's just out of envy. They're simply mad because the people who are being healed aren't listening to them. And so that's part of the conflict, or what's driving the conflict. But what happens is, even as you start to see Saul is taking a part in that, by the time we get to chapter 9, he's flipped. And he's preaching the very thing he was trying to stamp out and increase the persecution of. And it increases that division even more, because the people who he was once advocating on behalf of, the Pharisees, Sadducees, etc., now they're trying to kill him, and he's not safe in Damascus. So he moves to Jerusalem. They catch wind that he's doing the same thing there. He's not safe in Jerusalem. And it goes on and on from there. It is a choice that everybody's having to make as to whether or not they are personally going to take the path to reconciliation, or whether or not they are going to lean even further in to division. And that's all you're seeing in the book of Acts. And the thing that scares me every time I move to a different place, guest preaching, or preaching a different, I see the same thing happening all over the United States. I see the same thing happening over where I was in Southern Africa. I see the same thing happening where I was in South America. I can't remember the last time I didn't find a church that was facing some question with regard to division. And so the more I read the Gospels and the more I read the book of Acts, the more I see us reliving the very same things all over again. And the question is, which path are we going to take? Are we going to take the path that leads toward reconciliation, or are we going to take the path that God describes as worthless? And the worthless path is, say a few things I had in mind and just shut up. Part of what's happening with Stephen is, it's one of the great things that some of his friends said when they talked about this young man yesterday. It's like, yeah, he would debate with you, but you could tell he would debate in a way that allowed them to keep their respect for him. Otherwise, I don't think mom and dad are asking them to speak at the funeral. But what's happening is the debates here in Israel, they aren't debates anymore. They're turning into outright disputes. Because what's happening is, in this case of Stephen, is the disputes are really just an excuse for me to, outwardly what I'm doing is I'm still talking to you, sis, I'm still talking to you, brother. But what I'm really doing is I'm just looking for my next opportunity to get my point across. That's one of the things that led down the path of worthlessness. See, I'm acting like I'm talking to you and trying to reach a reasonable negotiation, but really all I'm doing is looking for my next opportunity to advance my point. That's one of the things that kept them divided. The other thing you see back in chapter 5, when they're going through this whole part about, like we said, the jealousy. It's not just the fear that I might be condemned, because there are a lot of people who are confessing. I remember some of my best clients when I was coming through. They talk about it all the time. They're the people who had the courage, beyond me in the days when I had trouble admitting the wrongs that I had done. They were people who didn't waste the court's time by trying to pretend like they didn't do it. See, those were the ones who ended up getting what they would typically call the best deals. Because depending upon what you did, if people could trust you in talking about what it is that you did wrong, then they were willing to show you a little bit more mercy when it came time for sentencing. And that's one of the things that I had to begin to realize as I was letting go of all the anxiety I had about just confessing and admitting the things that I was doing wrong. Confession, if it's really an act of faith, it leads to a lot more mercy than I might otherwise have realized during the days when I was simply trying to keep up appearances. And that's what's happening in the chapter 17, verse 17 and 18 of chapter 5 thing. But then when you look back in verses 28 and then 33, it reminded me that the anger is not the problem. The question is what I do with my anger. Because what happens in a time of division, when I'm super heated and I'm angry, everybody has a right to be angry, especially to the degree we've really been offended. Because the part of the problem with conflict is you even look at me wrong. Sometimes I've been through enough where that's going to start some things going. And I'm going to start on a cycle where just that look, I could misinterpret it, right? And that look can start conflict all over again in a situation where we could get on the path to healing. And so what happens is Gamaliel steps up in a time when the slightest thing was setting them back on that path of the success of the things that they were doing well are starting to make me feel real bad about where my life isn't right now. As I've told you before, every now and again I get the question, do you miss the practice? Do you miss being a lawyer? And I know what it goes to. A lot of times it comes from my friends who are in the same circle of friends. Some of my friends are judges now. Yeah, right? That's not pulling, right? Some of them are the deans of law schools. That's not name dropping. That's people asking me, do you regret not doing that kind of stuff too, Marcus? And if I'm not careful, yeah, I'll be a little bit jealous. I'll do some soul searching. And their success will cause me to maybe be a little bit jealous. But you know what happens? When I begin to realize that those friends still have my best interest in mind, then I stop being as intimidated by their success as much as I begin to want to partner in it. And so when my family is in trouble and that dean of the law school has a couple people they can call to help us get it right, because now we need a lawyer, I feel a whole lot worse if all I've been doing is backbiting that friend who's been doing well, just because I'm a little bit jealous. But it's easier to pick up the phone if I realize that I need God to come into my heart and help me cheer for them again, no matter what had happened to us or between us in the past. Likewise, those friends who are doing other stuff. It's one thing for me to pretend like I'm not bothered by that at all. Yeah, I'm just happy being a preacher. That's just the path. Yeah, that part of that's true. I don't miss the practice. But I'd be lying if I didn't say that I needed God to help me overcome some of those times when I'm not completely okay with it, right? And so the reason why that matters for what I mentioned with this church is to the degree we begin to feel a little bit less every time somebody else on the other side of this division seems to be doing a little bit better. We're never going to be able to reconcile. Beyond bringing people back into the church building, God doesn't care necessarily as much whether we sit together. He cares whether our hearts are with regard to one another. And so until I get to a point where I can legitimately begin to cheer for those with whom I'm upset again, whether the numbers ever come back, I'm going to still be in a place that God considers to be a worthless path, because it's going to manifest in my behavior. And what's happening here is each time something happens between the apostles and the Sadducees, and the apostles and the Sadducees. Unlike Gamaliel, unlike Joseph of Arimathea, unlike Nicodemus, who have put themselves or positioned themselves as peacemakers, as Christ said in the very beginning of his mission or ministry, blessed are the peacemakers. Everybody else is allowing the animosity to provoke them into undermining everybody else who's on the other side. And here's the problem. One of those terms that's associated with that whole concept of worthlessness, especially when it's assigned to people, is something we've talked about before, but I've skipped over preaching it. It's because, it's not the right time, it doesn't really fit. It's one of the reasons why over and over the word cautions us in the way that we use our mouth. James, as you are going through right now, talks about who can tame the tongue? Who can tame the tongue? Right? It sets ablaze. It's a rudder that turns large ships, a small member that does great damage, or it can create great healing. Gamaliel's tongue here creates great healing. Even though he doesn't fix everything, he sets everybody back on a path where you got to make the choice. You can heal if that's the path you choose to take, but you can walk right back off of this path of healing again and use your tongue to do even more damage than was done before. And so that's the problem. It's because here, it's not just a problem. It's the problem. I want to say on the flip side, there's a blessing on the other end of that problem. The other word, if you look at the way the worthlessness is used in the Proverbs over and over in the wisdom literature, much of it attributed to Solomon, the wisest king in the history of Israel, in the world at that time, he talks about the worthless person is that talebearer or that backbiter, or as we've said before, that individual who refuses to deal with conflict in the open, but finds a comfort space in talking and demeaning others behind their back. That's literal biblical worthlessness as God defines it. And at some point, maybe it'll be good to do a study on that concept. But understand the blessing, as we've heard from Brother Glenn, is even though the old covenant does great pains to give us the kinds of personalities that God describes as worthless, those who won't hear, they won't listen. No matter how reasonable or simple the appeal is, they won't listen. Those who, no matter how much God tells us that the Holy Spirit is the Spirit of truth, truth is just optional for them. And so just much like in the way of Naboth's vineyard, Jezebel didn't have any problem finding a couple of guys who'd say anything for the right price. God says, the less I value truth, the more of a worthless individual I am to him. And then likewise, when we see the whole concept of Sheba and Sheba's rebellion, the problem with Sheba is you already got to see what happened between Saul and David. No matter how much David sinned, you saw what happened between Absalom and David. Brother, it's time to get off of that worthless path. And Sheba represented one who simply refused to get off of the path towards conflict. And much like we're seeing in the Acts, he's consistently allowed himself to play the role of undermining the success of other believers. And that is the thing that caught my attention most. And so ultimately, I told the young people last week, sometimes God leaves me up here flailing because that's the only way he'll get the truth out of me. And so sometimes when the outline and the way I wanted to say it, it begins to fail. Sometimes you're right, sis, thank you. Sometimes you just got to say what's on your mind and on your heart. And ultimately, that's kind of where I'm at. Inartfully stated, I appreciate what our brother did yesterday. But I had that one concern I wanted to make sure I took care of. Because ultimately, I don't believe our brother, I don't say it stay in the negative, stay in the affirmative. I believe our brother wants healing just as much as everyone else. And the question is, at what cost? At what cost? And what role are we going to play in trying to at least take a step, skip the numbers, even if I can't speak for the elders speak for themselves. But I just know in life there have been times when we talked about toward the end of John. One of the recurring themes in John's gospel is Jesus himself did things that seemed like they were recurrently self-destructive. When he changed the water to wine, got a big old following, right? What's the next thing he's doing? Flipping over tables in the temple, right? Every time it seems like his following's starting to get big, he's doing things to reduce the numbers again. Why? Because he's focused more on the quality of what's around him than the quantity. And so I can't speak for the elders, but I'm saying I've seen that in the ministry of Christ. And there are times when sometimes whittling the numbers back just gives us an opportunity to focus on something that, God willing, It's much like the prodigal, right? When the prodigal came back home, he had a healthy environment to come home to. And so likewise, God willing, we don't know whether anyone will come back from those right now who don't feel like this is a welcoming place. But the best that we can do is make sure that if they decide to come home, they find it the kind of healthy environment that any of us would want to come home to. If we can simply put ourselves in their perspective and realize that we weren't always the ones who stayed home. There's some times when we left home and we needed a welcoming environment to come back to. You know, I've traveled all over the world. Not all over the world. That's preacher talk, right? I've traveled to a couple different countries. You don't always have the plan laid out like you would like, right? Oh, I'll come back to this pulpit and we'll do this and we'll do that. No. Sometimes you don't move back to your own place because you don't know what's next, so you move back home. And so that's all I'm talking about. What I'm saying is God willing, can we take what we saw yesterday in honoring that young man and make sure that as people consider, whether it's just out in the community or whether it's physically being back here, when they decide how they're going to relate to this congregation, can we do the kinds of things that make it clear that they've got a healthy home to come back to, whatever path they choose, as we together stand and sing.